The cold metal clip of a Sennheiser lavalier microphone snapped onto the lapel of a tailored $3,000 Armani blazer. They had forced me into this deeply claustrophobic, blindingly lit backstage dressing room at the Channel 8 broadcast studio under the guise of family support. But the reality was, they just needed a drab, blue-collar visual prop to make her look more sophisticated by contrast. I was kneeling on the cold linoleum, running a sticky lint roller over the hem of her skirt. My lower spine was screaming. The familiar, agonizing electrical shocks of severe sciatica shot down my numb legs, tightly bound in a rigid medical back brace, and there she sat, checking her perfectly curated, utterly fraudulent smile in the glaring vanity mirror. She looked down at me like a problem she had completely paved over. "Ethics aren't about what you do, darling," she said, her voice terrifyingly calm. "They are about how the world perceives what you do. Perception is reality." The network executives and the wealthy private school board members, squeezed into the tiny room, nodded in blind, complicit agreement. I didn't blink. I just looked at the lint roller. I stayed perfectly still. They had absolutely no idea that in exactly 4 minutes, the 3-part reconstructed forensic dossier resting heavily inside my grease-stained canvas work bag would completely vaporize her fake empire. If you have ever had to kneel on a concrete floor in blinding physical agony, acting as a subservient prop for the exact same blood relative who was actively framing you for a federal felony, tell me how you stopped yourself from tearing the room apart. The heavy, rhythmic, metallic thump-thump-thump of a 40-ton compactor slamming down onto hard dirt rattled the fillings in my teeth. It was 5:15 a.m., a Tuesday, and the cab of the machine smelled heavily of diesel and stale coffee. My name is Elena. I am 32 years old, and I am a heavy equipment operator. To understand how we ended up in that dressing room, you have to understand the foundation I was trying to protect. My grandfather was a quiet, relentless man. He built our family's modest excavation business from the dirt up. His pride and joy was a pristine, heavily customized 1970s Caterpillar backhoe. He maintained that machine like it was a sacred artifact. It was the tool of his trade, the physical embodiment of a lifetime of honest sweat. When he passed away, I took the keys to the LLC. I lived in the cab of those machines, 14-hour days, vibrating in a metal box, breathing methane and dust, managing the physics of compaction over millions of tons of municipal waste. The mechanical vibration of the heavy equipment was brutal on the human body. It permanently compressed my spine. I was constantly rationing a $15 generic bottle of anti-inflammatory pills just to get out of bed, my lower legs frequently going entirely numb. Meanwhile, my Aunt Evelyn existed in a completely different reality. She was the fiercely controlling headmistress of the city's most elite private academy. She was universally revered by the wealthy political class as a paragon of virtue, a public saint. She sat in a $400 ergonomic massage chair in her pristine faculty office, sipping imported teas, while actively orchestrating a $1.5 million historical renovation on her massive Victorian mansion. Honestly, the math alone was enough to make you sick. $1.5 million for imported Italian marble and custom landscaping versus my $15 generic pills. And the family, they didn't just accept this massive disparity, they worshipped it. The day I officially signed the county paperwork to take full ownership of my grandfather's excavation LLC, I bought a cheap grocery store sheet cake. I sat at my small Formica kitchen table alone. No one showed up, not a single person. My grandmother and my older cousin had completely boycotted the milestone so they could attend Evelyn's Decade of Excellence black tie gala at the academy. I spent the night of my biggest professional achievement, eating a slice of stale vanilla cake in my dirty high-vis work shirt, scrolling through my phone as my grandmother posted 40 pictures of Evelyn in a designer gown, tagging it, "Generational Greatness." I was holding a heavy, monogrammed brass paperweight in my calloused hands. It had a deep, distinct scratch across the bottom edge. I didn't know it yet, But that mundane, useless chunk of metal was the exact weapon that would eventually send my saintly, untouchable aunt to a federal penitentiary. You see, fighting Evelyn was impossible because of the shield she had built around herself. Everything was about optics. If you ever tried to point out her cruelty, you were instantly branded as a bitter, jealous failure who just couldn't handle her success. My grandmother was her primary enforcer. She was entirely obsessed with our family's social standing. She had this toxic neutrality where she completely ignored reality to protect Evelyn's image. I remember driving home in a freezing rainstorm after a 16-hour shift. I parked my truck and walked up the driveway. My grandmother physically rushed out onto the porch in the freezing downpour to aggressively sweep my muddy work boots off the welcome mat and into the wet bushes. Why? Because Evelyn was coming over for dinner, and my grandmother couldn't let my aunt's pristine eyes be offended by the reality of blue-collar dirt. She literally swept my existence into the mud so Evelyn wouldn't have to look at it. She used to tell me that Evelyn was molding the future leaders of the city and that we simply had to absorb the shock so she could shine. Then there was my cousin, Julian, a deeply pretentious literature professor who relied entirely on Evelyn's influence for his academic tenure. He treated me like a fascinating, low IQ specimen. He would adjust his wire-rimmed glasses at family dinners and deliver these vicious, elitist insults disguised as philosophical observations. He would smirk and casually mention how it takes a certain level of high intellect to understand systemic institutional growth, whereas I simply moved trash from one pile to another. The whole room would laugh. The only person in her entire orbit who ever saw the truth was Mr. Henderson, the veteran janitor at the academy. Whenever I had to drop off topsoil or gravel for the school's groundskeeping, he would pass by me in the hallway with his mop bucket. While Evelyn was busy ignoring me, he would give me this tiny, almost imperceptible nod of solidarity. Just a quiet acknowledgement between two people who knew exactly how much bleach it took to cover up the rot. But the real reason I endured it, the reason I didn't just walk away and let them have their fake high society lives, was Leo, my younger brother. He is completely nonverbal, physically disabled, and relies entirely on a highly specialized, locally funded care program. The only reason I pushed my body past its absolute structural limits, ignoring the shooting nerve pain, wearing that rigid brace until it left permanent bruises on my ribs, was to keep the LLC profitable enough to cover his secondary medical costs. Evelyn knew this. She knew Leo was my absolute weak point. She frequently held her political influence over my head. If I ever stepped out of line, or if I ever embarrassed her in front of her wealthy board members, she would casually mention how easily she could lobby the local politicians to cut funding to Leo's specific care program. She actively weaponized an innocent, voiceless boy to ensure my total subservience. She was the architect of a perfect, suffocating trap. I thought the emotional abuse was the worst of it. I thought the worst thing she could do was erase my grandfather's legacy and treat me like the family embarrassment. I was wrong. The psychological games were just a distraction. She wasn't just hiding her disdain for me. She was actively using me to bury a massive, systemic crime. The sharp, metallic shriek of my rusted mailbox hinge echoed across the empty dirt driveway. It was a Wednesday, 6:14 p.m. The sky was the color of bruised iron, and my hands were still coated in a thin layer of gray dust from the landfill. I pulled out a thick, heavy envelope. It wasn't standard mail. It was thick, cream-colored cardstock, stamped with the deep blue official seal of the State Attorney General's office. I tore the flap open with a dirty thumb. I unfolded the paper. The text read, "Notice of pending indictment, Elena Excavation, LLC. Investigation into systemic racketeering and embezzlement of $1,524,000 via fraudulent vendor invoicing, subject to immediate asset freeze." The hydraulic pressure in my chest suffered a total catastrophic blowout, dropping the entire load of reality onto my spine. My vision completely blurred into gray static. The ringing in my ears drowned out the low hum of the highway traffic. I couldn't feel my legs. I just stood there in the gravel, my work boots sinking into the mud, staring at the exact dollar amount. $1,524,000. Evelyn didn't just steal from the private school's endowment fund. She legally structured her entire fake vendor network to pin the absolute financial ruin squarely onto my grandfather's small, honest company, disguising her theft as phantom groundskeeper duties. She was going to let me go to federal prison so she could buy imported Italian marble for her mansion. And the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her sociopathy didn't hit me until exactly 3 days later at our mandatory Sunday family dinner. I walked into my grandmother's dining room. My hands were shaking so hard I had to keep them shoved deep inside the pockets of my cheap denim jacket. Evelyn was already there, holding a glass of Chardonnay, wearing a brand new cashmere sweater. She saw me walk in, gave me this terrifyingly calm, pitying smile, and handed me a cheap plastic bag. "I picked this up for you at the pharmacy, Elena," she said, her voice dripping with fake maternal concern. "You've been looking so aggressive and tense lately." I opened the bag. It was a $4 generic stress relief adult coloring book and a small box of cheap, waxy crayons. "Just color inside the lines," she whispered, patting my shoulder. "It will help you manage your blue-collar anger." I looked at the $4 coloring book. Then I thought about the $52 million indictment sitting in my truck. She used the stolen endowment funds to completely renovate her historical mansion and buy political influence, and she handed me a dollar store coloring book to shut me up. If you have ever sat completely paralyzed in a brightly lit room, holding the physical, paper proof of your own destruction in one hand and a pathetic $4 insult in the other, take a heavy breath and tell me how you survived that first suffocating hour. How did you biologically force your heart to keep beating when you realized your own blood was actively digging your grave? I didn't color inside the lines. I slapped the cream-colored indictment letter directly onto the mahogany dining table. "Evelyn, you ran the—" "Lower your voice, Elena. We are eating," Evelyn snapped, not even looking at the paper. "You routed $1 million in fake invoices through my grandfather's LLC." I slammed my knuckles against the wood. "You framed me." Evelyn finally looked at me. She didn't look guilty. She looked profoundly annoyed that I was interrupting her wine. She set her glass down, smoothed an invisible wrinkle on her cashmere sleeve, and leaned forward. She didn't yell, she just looked past me, directly into the living room where my younger brother, Leo, was sitting in his specialized wheelchair, watching a cartoon. "You know, Elena," Evelyn said, her voice dropping to a clinical, razor-sharp whisper, "the county zoning board is reviewing the municipal budget for Leo's care facility next week. I have a dinner with the board chairman on Tuesday. It would be a catastrophic shame if a sudden, ugly public scandal defunded his entire specialized wing." My jaw locked. The air violently rushed out of my lungs. "You wouldn't," I choked out. "I am a pillar of this community." She smiled, her eyes completely dead. "I protect the vulnerable, but if an erratic, angry heavy machinery operator starts making wild, baseless accusations, the board might question the stability of the family receiving state funds." My grandmother didn't even look up from her plate. She just aggressively cut her roast beef. "She's just stressed, Evelyn. Don't make a scene over paperwork, Elena. Your aunt is molding the future of this city." Julian, my cousin, scoffed loudly from across the table, swirling his red wine. "Honestly, Elena, you don't even understand basic corporate tax structures. You move dirt for a living. Stop being hysterical and sit down." They closed ranks. A perfect, impenetrable wall of toxic complicity. I looked at Leo in the other room. He was completely innocent. He couldn't speak, he couldn't defend himself, and Evelyn was holding his literal biological survival over my head like a loaded gun. I couldn't scream. I couldn't call the police. If I fought back right then, Leo would lose his medical care before the ink on a police report even dried. I was completely, utterly paralyzed. I snatched the indictment off the table, turned around, and walked out the front door into the freezing night. I drove back to the equipment yard. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. I parked my rusted truck, walked into the massive, echoing corrugated steel shed, and crawled directly underneath the massive steel tracks of my 40-ton compactor. I lay flat on my back on the freezing, oil-stained dirt floor. The rigid plastic of my medical back brace dug viciously into my ribs. The chronic sciatica radiating down my compressed spine was blinding, but I didn't care. I needed the dark. I needed the weight of the steel above me. And I just broke. It wasn't a quiet, dignified crying. It was pathetic. I was hyperventilating so hard I was choking on the smell of 10W30 motor oil and damp earth. I shoved my dirty hands over my face and I sobbed until my ribs physically cracked with the force of it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that $1.52 million number, and then I saw Leo's wheelchair, and then I saw that stupid, cheap coloring book. My brain it just short-circuited. I couldn't process the sheer malice of it. I lay there in the dirt, shivering violently, biting down on my own heavy canvas glove to muffle the sound of my screaming. And then, someone left the small battery-operated radio on a workbench nearby. It was tuned to the local NPR station. Through the static, I heard her voice. Ethical stewardship isn't just a career, it's a calling. Evelyn's smooth, perfectly modulated voice echoed through the dark, greasy shed. At the Academy, we believe in moral fortitude. We believe in taking responsibility for the less fortunate. I stopped crying. I lay perfectly still on the dirt floor. The cold seeped through my jacket, numbing the agonizing pain in my lower back. I listened to the radio host thank her for her incredible philanthropic work. I listened to her accept the praise. The panic attack just evaporated. The desperate, suffocating need for my family's love, the conditioned reflex of being the good, quiet scapegoat, it all died right there on the floor of that equipment shed. I realized I wasn't dealing with a difficult ant. I was dealing with a parasite that had completely hollowed out my family's reality. I couldn't just fight Evelyn in a screaming match. I slowly sat up. I wiped the mixture of grease, dirt, and tears off my face with the back of my bruised hand. I looked up at the massive steel undercarriage of the compactor. I realized I had to stop absorbing their shock. I had to stop acting like a victim and start grading the earth for a total structural demolition. The brutal, fluorescent flicker of my garage shop light buzzed against my retinas. It was 2 a.m. I was standing over a massive plywood workbench, staring at 3 heavy-duty black trash bags sitting next to my socket wrenches. Mr. Henderson, the Academy's veteran janitor, had quietly loaded them into the bed of my work truck earlier that afternoon. He didn't say a word. He just left a single, yellow sticky note slapped to the plastic. It read, "Executive Office. Jammed." She threw the whole thing out. I untied the plastic knot and dumped the contents onto the plywood. Thousands of razor-thin strips of white paper spilled out, mixed with coffee grounds and a heavy monogrammed brass paperweight. The paperweight had Evelyn's initials engraved in cursive. Her absolute arrogance was almost hard to comprehend. She had accidentally dropped her vanity paperweight into the executive shredder, completely destroying the motorized blades, and instead of manually pulling the sensitive financial documents out of the jammed casing, she assumed she was untouchable. She assumed a blue-collar janitor would blindly throw the heavy machine into the dumpster, and that no one on earth had the patience or the intellect to look closer. But as I stared at the mountain of shredded paper, the adrenaline from the equipment shed completely vanished. The gaslight hangover hit me like a physical blow. My hands, they started shaking. I hovered my calloused fingers over the shredded strips, and I could hear my grandmother's condescending voice echoing in my head. What if I'm just being hysterical? What if it's a mistake? What if I'm exactly as stupid as Julian says I am, and I'm just looking for a reason to ruin her success? I mean, I literally picked up a handful of the shreds to throw them into the incinerator. I was so deeply conditioned to protect the family, my first instinct was to destroy the evidence of my own murder. I stood there, my spine throbbing with a dull, sickening ache, fighting 30 years of brainwashing. But then I looked at the heavy brass paperweight. I looked at the deep, mechanical gouge in the metal where the shredder blades had violently seized. I set the trash bag down. I was running on pure fumes and friction, but over the next 3 weeks, I didn't sleep. Every night, after 14 hours of bone-crushing compaction work, I sat at that plywood bench with a roll of clear packing tape and a pair of tweezers. I meticulously reconstructed her garbage. It was a grueling, agonizing process. I cross-referenced the torn paper grains, matching the jagged edges of watermarked bank stationery, and at the very bottom of the jammed casing, I found it. The blades had seized before they could finish the job. The final layer of documents survived intact, just crumpled into a tight accordion fold beneath the brass weight. I carefully smoothed the pages out against the wood. It was evidence 3, the kill shot. The original forged vendor invoices. The documents were devastatingly complete. I stared at the crisp black ink. The page read, Invoice #409, Phantom Grounds Regrading, $85,000. Pay to order, Elena Excavation, LLC, authorized by E. Vance. But the money wasn't routed to my grandfather's company. I traced the routing numbers with my dirty fingernail. The federal wire went directly to a shell corporation registered to Evelyn's home address. It was signed in her distinct, wet blue ink. And right in the center of her signature was a deep, circular indentation. The exact physical impression of her heavy brass paperweight pressing the paper into the metal shredder teeth. Undeniable, forensic physical proof. But I knew one invoice wasn't enough. If I just brought this to the police, Evelyn would hire a massive legal team and claim it was a clerical error. I had to dismantle her entire support system. I needed the digital back end. Because I handled the academy's exterior maintenance, I still had a set of master keys to the basement administrative wing. 2 nights later, I parked my truck 3 blocks away from the school and walked through the freezing rain. I let myself into the dark, silent building. The air smelled like floor wax and old radiator heat. I slipped into the bursar's office and powered on the primary accounting terminal. The bureaucracy of the old network was agonizing. The loading bar crawled across the screen while I constantly checked the hallway shadows. I bypassed the standard files and dug into the deep IP server logs. Evelyn didn't understand digital architecture. She didn't realize that every single keystroke was tracked by the master server. I found the creation logs for the fraudulent invoices. This was evidence 1, the trapdoor. I pulled up the user history. The screen glowed harshly in the dark room. It read, User, J. Vance, Guest Academic Terminal, Document Created, Phantom, Invoice Mass.doc, Timestamp, 11:42 p.m. Julian. My deeply pretentious, highly educated cousin wasn't just a bystander. He was the one actively drafting the fake invoices on his university laptop to cover Evelyn's tracks, securing his own academic tenure with stolen money. I exported the raw server logs onto my flash drive. He was going to burn right next to her. I just needed the final piece. The grandmother. I crept down the silent hallway to the security server room. I needed to pull the CCTV archives to see who was physically walking the stolen cash into the banks. I popped the server rack with a flathead screwdriver and plugged my drive in. The progress bar crept to 15%. Then, the heavy, unmistakable clack of expensive leather heels echoed on the marble floor at the end of the corridor. My blood turned to ice. It was Evelyn. She was walking toward the administrative wing, her voice echoing as she complained loudly to someone on her cell phone. The download bar hit 43%. Her footsteps grew louder. Clack. 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 She was 20 feet away from the server room door. I couldn't breathe. My chest. I felt like my ribs were locking up. The room offered absolutely zero cover. Just a rolling office chair and the humming server racks. I looked up. The industrial hay vac return vent was directly above the racks, secured by 4 Phillips head screws. My hands shook violently. I grabbed my screwdriver and ripped the screws out of the drywall, catching the heavy metal grate before it crashed to the floor. I grabbed the edge of the drywall opening and hoisted my entire body weight up into the ceiling. My lower spine exploded in blinding, white-hot agony. The rigid plastic of my back brace scraped against the sharp galvanized steel ducting. I shoved the grate partially back into place just as the server room door swung open. I lay entirely flat on the cold sheet metal, my face pressed against the dust, biting down on my own lip so hard I tasted copper. I couldn't make a sound. Evelyn walked into the room. She stood directly below me. I could smell the sharp tang of her expensive aerosol hairspray. She sighed, complaining into her phone about the catering for her upcoming television appearance, completely oblivious to the flash drive still sticking out of the server rack. She paced the room for exactly 3 minutes. It felt like a decade. Finally, she scoffed, turned off the light, and snapped the door shut. I waited until her footsteps faded completely. I dropped back down to the floor, my legs buckling underneath me. I yanked the flash drive out of the terminal. When I got back to the safety of my truck, I plugged the drive into my battered laptop to verify the files. I didn't just get the CCTV footage showing my grandmother depositing the stolen checks. I found a synced backup of Evelyn's iCloud messages from the school's iPad. I opened a deleted text thread between Evelyn and my grandmother. This was evidence too, the character assassination. I read the text my grandmother had sent exactly 3 days after I was forced to sell my grandfather's original tools just to pay for my back medication. The message read, "I know Elena's spine is failing, and she can't afford her pills, but if we don't finish your parlor renovations before the television crew arrives, what will the board think of us? I deposited the $40,000 today. Keep her busy." I stared at the glowing screen in the dark cab of my truck. She knew. My grandmother knew exactly how much physical agony I was in. She watched me limp through the front door, covered in mud, and actively chose to sacrifice my bodily survival to fund Evelyn's living room wallpaper. The stutters in my mind permanently stopped. The hesitation vanished. I didn't shake anymore. The structural grade of my reality was finally stabilized. I was holding 3 distinct, undeniable payloads of absolute ruin. I closed the laptop, placed it into my heavy canvas work bag, and turned the ignition key. The heavy, reinforced glass doors of the Municipal Credit Union, unlocking at exactly 8 a.m., sent a sharp shockwave up my spine. I was the first person inside the lobby. I sat across from a loan officer whose cheap cologne smelled heavily of artificial pine. I wasn't just moving Leo to a new building. I had to completely sever his existence from Evelyn's financial jurisdiction. Evelyn had the county zoning board firmly in her pocket. If she realized I was actively building a federal case against her, she would execute an absolute containment breach and cut his state funding immediately, just to watch me bleed. I had to build an impenetrable retaining wall around him before I ever walked into that television studio. I liquidated my grandfather's final emergency equipment repair fund. All of it, $32,000 in heavy machinery equity, transferred directly into a certified cashier's check. The loan officer stared at me, his fingers hovering over his keyboard. He hit print. The slow, agonizing crawl of the bank's dot matrix printer sounded exactly like a countdown. Next came the medical bureaucracy. I drove across town to the state health department. I stood in line behind fluorescent-lit counters for 3 straight hours, constantly shifting my weight from foot to foot, just to relieve the sharp electrical pain shooting down my left leg. I filed an emergency change of guardianship jurisdiction. I paid the exorbitant out-of-pocket expedition fees with my last working credit card. I specifically requested a private, high-security care facility located 3 hours north, completely outside Evelyn's political district. I sat in a rigid plastic chair, sweating through my heavy denim jacket, staring blankly at the clerk's blinking cursor on the screen. The friction of the legal system was suffocating. Every second that passed felt like a window closing. Finally, the clerk aggressively stamped the manila file with red ink. The transfer was legally binding. It was 2:15 a.m. on a Thursday, when I pulled my rusted truck up to the back loading dock of Leo's local care center. I had coordinated the extraction strictly with the night nurse, a woman who absolutely despised Evelyn's performative, camera-ready charity visits. The silence of the parking lot was deafening. Every snap of a twig under my boots, every distant wail of a highway siren, made the muscles in my chest lock up. I walked down the dim, linoleum-tiled hallway. The squeak of my rubber soles sounded like gunshots in the dead air. I entered Leo's room. He was awake, staring at the ceiling, his specialized wheelchair parked perfectly near the edge of the bed. I didn't speak. I couldn't risk the sound carrying down the hall to the administrative desks. I just stepped forward and gently tapped his shoulder. Moving him was a brutal, intensely physical ordeal. He couldn't assist with his own body weight. I had to slide my forearms under him, brace my boots against the cheap linoleum floor, and lift his dead weight into the chair. My compressed spine screamed. A violent, white-hot muscle spasm tore through my lower back, nearly dropping me to my knees right there on the floor. I clamped my mouth shut, swallowing a groan, tasting the sharp iron of my own blood where I bit down on my inner cheek. I locked my knees, forced my body upward, and dropped him gently into the seat. I wheeled him out into the freezing night air. The hydraulic liftgate on the back of my truck whined loudly in the dark. I constantly checked my surroundings, utterly convinced I would see Evelyn's expensive headlights turning onto the street to stop me. I strapped his chair down to the floorboards with heavy-duty canvas ratchet straps. The heavy, metallic clack-clack-clack of the ratchets locking into place felt incredibly loud. We drove for 3 hours in absolute silence. The cold wind whipped through the cracked seal of my driver's side window. The dashboard glowed a dull green. Every single time a pair of headlights appeared in my rearview mirror, my hands slicked with sweat against the steering wheel. I kept checking my phone sitting in the cup holder, terrified of seeing a missed call from my grandmother, or a text from Evelyn realizing the asset she weaponized was gone. The screen stayed completely dark. We arrived at the new facility in the northern county just as the sun started to rise over the tree line. It was a private, highly secure compound, surrounded by tall wrought iron fencing. I walked into the intake office and slapped the heavy cashier's check onto the mahogany desk. It covered exactly 6 months of premium, untouchable care. No local politicians, no zoning boards, no Evelyn. I wheeled Leo into his new, quiet room. I unpacked his small canvas duffel bag. I placed his favorite weighted blanket onto the mattress. He looked at me, his eyes tracking my movements. He didn't say anything, but his breathing visibly slowed down. The tension in his small shoulders dropped. He was safe. I stood in the doorway and looked directly at the intake administrator. I kept my voice low, dropping the volume to a raspy, exhausted whisper. I instructed them, explicitly, that under absolutely no circumstances was my aunt, my grandmother, or my cousin allowed past the front security gate. I handed them the notarized copies of the state guardianship forms. I walked out into the hallway. The heavy, magnetic lock on the ward doors clicked shut behind me with a loud, definitive thud. The leverage was dead. They didn't hold the leash anymore. Evelyn and the family thought they still had a gun pressed to my head, but I had just completely emptied the chamber in the dark. Now I just had to secure my invitation to the execution. The sharp, aggressive hiss of boiling water shooting from a commercial garment steamer hit my knuckles. It was Thursday morning, exactly 48 hours before Evelyn was scheduled to go live on the Channel 8 morning broadcast. I was standing in the massive, echoey foyer of her newly renovated historical mansion, surrounded by imported Italian marble and custom mahogany trim. Honestly, acting nice was harder than the actual planning. I had to walk into her house, a house paid for with my grandfather's blood and my stolen future, and pretend that the federal indictment had completely broken my spirit. I kept my shoulders slumped. I let my voice shake. I begged her to let me accompany her to the television studio on Saturday morning. I told her I was terrified of the state investigators, that I didn't understand the legal paperwork, and that I desperately needed her moral guidance to navigate the trouble. She absolutely devoured it. The sheer arrogance of her ego couldn't resist playing the benevolent savior to her pathetic, blue-collar niece. She agreed to let me come to the dressing room as her assistant, claiming she needed to keep an eye on my erratic behavior anyway. But to secure the invitation, I had to pay the toll. She forced me to prep her wardrobe for the broadcast. I was down on my hands and knees on the freezing stone floor, my rigid medical back brace digging viciously into my ribs. The chronic sciatica radiating down my compressed spine was blinding. I was carefully running the heavy, spitting steamer over the hem of her $3,000 Armani blazer, while she stood above me, sipping an espresso and complaining. She was actively whining to me that her luxury contractor had used eggshell white instead of alabaster on the $40,000 crown molding in the dining room. Look, if you were kneeling on cold stone, in agonizing physical pain, actively serving the woman who was trying to send you to federal prison while she whined about the color of her stolen paint, what would you do? Do you honestly have the cold, sociopathic restraint to swallow that pure humiliation and play the long game? Or would you have snapped and thrown the boiling steamer directly at her face? I swallowed it. I nodded, apologized for missing a wrinkle, and kept steaming. Then, her phone buzzed on the kitchen island. She was in the other room shouting at her interior designer over the phone. I stood up slowly, my spine popping, and glanced at her glowing screen. It was a massive group chat titled, Family and Board Updates. I read the massive paragraph my grandmother had just posted to our extended relatives and Evelyn's wealthy academy board members. It was a masterclass in weaponized concern. The text read, "We are deeply worried about Elena's declining mental health. The physical stress of her heavy machinery job has unfortunately led to a severe painkiller addiction. She is completely unstable. If she acts erratic this week or creates paranoid delusions about the school's finances, please ignore her. She is just trying to deflect from her substance abuse. We are intervening to get her psychiatric help." My blood ran completely cold. Therapy speak used as an absolute bludgeon. They were executing a preemptive digital quarantine. They were setting the psychological firebreak so that if I ever tried to show anyone the indictment or scream the truth, everyone would just shake their heads with pity and call me a desperate junkie. The sheer, calculating evil of it was breathtaking. But it didn't cause a panic attack this time. I was way past the point of emotional shock. The structural fatigue of my own body didn't matter anymore. I was actively calculating the exact payload limit required to collapse their entire toxic foundation. Friday afternoon, less than 18 hours before the broadcast. I drove my rusted truck downtown and parked illegally outside the state attorney general's field office. I walked into the sterile, heavily air-conditioned lobby, wearing my dirty high-vis jacket and work boots. The receptionist looked at me like I was a lost vagrant. She sighed loudly and tried to hand me a generic citizen complaint form. I didn't take it. I slapped the cream-colored indictment letter directly onto her keyboard. "My name is Elena," I said, keeping my voice dead flat. "I am the primary target on this $1.5 million racketeering file. Get me the lead investigator right now, or I walk to the local news." The bureaucratic friction was agonizing. I sat in a cramped, windowless interrogation room for 2 straight hours. The air smelled heavily of stale coffee and ozone from a broken copy machine. Finally, a skeptical investigator wearing a cheap gray suit walked in. He looked exhausted, carrying a thick manila folder with my grandfather's LLC name stamped on it. He sat down and gave me this condescending look, fully expecting me to start crying and begging for a plea deal. I didn't give him a speech. I didn't cry. I unzipped my grease-stained canvas bag and slid the weaponized dossier across the scratched metal table. I showed him the digital server logs proving Julian forged the initial documents on the Academy's network. I watched his eyes narrow. I played the security footage of my grandmother depositing the stolen cash directly into Evelyn's private accounts. And then, I dropped the kill shot. I slid the reconstructed, original invoices across the table. I pointed my dirty fingernail at Evelyn's wet ink signature, the routing number to her personal shell company, and the deep, undeniable physical indentation of the brass paperweight crushing the paper grain. The investigator stopped breathing. He stared at the indentation. He touched it with his thumb. He looked up at me, and his entire demeanor completely shifted from bureaucratic boredom to absolute, terrifying focus. He didn't say a word. He just picked up his desk phone, dialed a 3-digit extension, and said, "Get the director in here. Now." It took another 4 hours of grueling logistical planning, signing sworn affidavits, and dealing with the friction of the legal system. But they realized Evelyn had orchestrated the entire fraud. I leaned forward over the metal table. I laid out the exact tactical perimeter. "Tomorrow morning, Channel 8 broadcast studio. Dressing room B," I told them. 6 a.m., the entire Academy Board of Directors will be in that room with her. We coordinated it perfectly. I instructed them to park 3 unmarked vehicles in the studio's back-loading dock alleyway at 5:45 a.m. Plainclothes detectives would enter through the service elevator and wait silently in the carpeted hallway outside the dressing room. They wouldn't breach the door until I sent exactly one text message to the lead investigator's burner phone. Just one word: clear. I walked out of the Attorney General's office into the dying evening light. The heavy glass doors clicked shut behind me. The bait was set. The exits were sealed. I got into my truck and turned the key. Dressing room B at the Channel 8 broadcast studio was a 12 by 12-foot concrete box, completely devoid of natural light. It was 5:50 a.m. I walked into the room carrying my heavy, grease-stained canvas work bag. The air was suffocatingly hot, baked by the blinding glare of a dozen exposed incandescent vanity bulbs lining the massive mirror. But it was the sound that drove the anxiety into my teeth. It wasn't a ticking clock. It was the high-pitched, mosquito-like electronic whine of the live broadcast feed monitors mounted in the corner. The hum vibrated right into my jawbone, layering over the sharp chemical tang of aerosol hairspray and burnt espresso. The room was packed entirely past its structural load capacity. 5 wealthy members of the Academy's board of directors were crammed onto a small leather sofa, checking their expensive watches and talking in hushed, self-important tones. My grandmother sat perfectly upright in a corner accent chair, clutching her designer handbag, completely ignoring my presence. And in the center of the room, sitting in the elevated makeup chair like a sovereign queen, was Evelyn. I was pushed entirely to the back wall. I stood next to a metal trash can, my rigid back brace locked tightly around my ribs. The physical pain radiating down my spine was a dull, heavy throb, but my mind was completely silent. The gaslight hangover was dead. I was a heavy equipment operator, looking at a demolition site, simply waiting for the exact right moment to trigger the charges. Julian, my cousin, leaned against the makeup counter next to Evelyn. He swirled a macchiato in a small paper cup, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, and looked me up and down with absolute disgust. He was the designated attack dog, ensuring the board members knew exactly where I stood in the hierarchy. "Honestly, Elena, you really shouldn't be in here," Julian said, his voice loud enough for the board president to hear. "It takes a certain level of intellect to understand systemic institutional growth and the pressures Evelyn faces today. You just move trash from one pile to another, try to stand in the corner and not ruin the optics when the cameras roll." The board members chuckled quietly. A few of them cast pitying glances at my dirty steel-toed boots scuffing the clean linoleum. I didn't flush. I didn't argue. I just stared at Julian's smug face, feeling the heavy, solid weight of the canvas bag hanging from my shoulder. He had absolutely no idea that his own digital signature was sitting on a flash drive at the bottom of that bag, ready to completely incinerate his academic tenure. Evelyn held up a manicured hand, gesturing for Julian to stop. She turned to the vanity mirror, checking her blush, and decided it was time to perform for her captive audience. "Julian, be kind," Evelyn sighed, delivering a perfectly calibrated tone of fake benevolence. She looked at the board members through the reflection of the glass, True ethical stewardship requires us to carry the heavy burdens so the less fortunate don't have to. The school's endowment, the massive renovations, the late nights, it is an exhausting cross to bear. But we absorb the shock. We do it for the children. We do it to build a legacy of moral fortitude. It was the absolute peak of her arrogance. She was literally bragging about the exhaustion of stealing $1.5 million, framing her massive federal felony as a heroic sacrifice for the community. The entire room was a landfill disguised as a country club, and I was simply watching the toxic runoff pool around their expensive shoes. My grandmother nodded solemnly from her corner, validating the lie. She refused to even make eye contact with me. "Speaking of optics," Evelyn said, glancing down at her tailored $3,000 Armani blazer. She noticed a microscopic speck of dust near the hem. She didn't ask one of the studio assistants. She looked directly at me in the mirror. "Elena, darling," she commanded, pointing a finger at the floor next to her chair. "Be useful. Get the lint roller out of my bag and clean this hem. I can't go on television looking like I work in a dirt pit." I walked forward. I set my heavy canvas bag onto the makeup counter. I pulled the sticky lint roller from her designer purse. I lowered my body down to the cold linoleum floor. My compressed spine screamed in protest. The plastic edges of my brace dug viciously into my skin. I knelt on the ground, effectively bowing at her feet in front of the city's most powerful elite, and began running the adhesive tape over the bottom of her skirt. The door to the dressing room opened. Mr. Henderson, the academy's veteran janitor, walked in carrying a fresh tray of bottled water for the board members. The studio had demanded the school provide their own trusted VIP support staff for the morning segment. He silently distributed the water, completely ignored by the wealthy men on the sofa. He turned to leave. As he reached the door, he stopped. He looked at the mirror and caught my eye in the reflection. He saw me kneeling on the floor, doing her dirty work. He didn't smile, he just tightened his jaw, gave me one microscopic, profound nod of validation, and stepped out into the hallway. I acknowledged the nod, but kept my face entirely expressionless. I knew the bomb I was about to drop was going to rip through the school's foundation, and even Mr. Henderson would have to deal with the fallout. But the demolition was unavoidable. The studio audio technician bustled into the room. He stepped over my legs and began threading the wire of a Sennheiser lavalier microphone under Evelyn's blazer. Evelyn looked down at me, still kneeling on the floor. She smiled, a terrifyingly calm, dead-eyed smile. She delivered her final, hypocritical insult. "Ethics aren't about what you do, darling," she said softly, ensuring the board members heard her profound wisdom. "They are about how the world perceives what you do. Perception is reality." The audio technician clipped the microphone onto her lapel. I just looked at her perfectly curated, utterly fraudulent smile in the vanity mirror, and I wondered if she had any idea how fast a fake empire burns when you cut the oxygen. Because I was about to find out. I finished rolling the lint. I stood up slowly. The heavy, rigid plastic of my medical back brace clicked audibly in the tiny, silent room. The pain in my spine was blinding, but my hands were completely steady. I didn't look at Evelyn. I set the sticky lint roller onto the makeup counter. I reached into the pocket of my denim jacket and pulled out my phone. I opened a blank text thread to a burner number. I typed one single word. "Clear." I hit send. I slid the phone back into my pocket. I turned to my heavy, grease-stained canvas work bag sitting on the counter. I pulled the heavy brass zipper open. I reached inside and pulled out 3 thick, heavy manila folders. The paper was incredibly dense, thick, watermarked legal stock, and stamped across the top left corner of every single folder, in violent, unmistakable red ink, was the official seal of the State Attorney General's office. The forced, polite murmurs of the wealthy board members instantly died. The high-pitched electronic whine of the broadcast monitor was the only sound left in the room. I didn't scream. I didn't raise my voice. I executed the drop with the cold, absolute precision of someone who had spent their entire life burying trash. I turned directly to Julian. He was still holding his paper coffee cup, his elitist smirk frozen on his face, confused by the official red stamps. I slapped the first folder directly onto the glass vanity counter. It hit the wood with a heavy, definitive smack. Payload A, I said internally, my brain operating in pure staccato logic. Out loud, my voice was dead flat. I flipped the heavy cover open. Forensic IP server logs, I stated, staring dead into Julian's eyes. Pulled directly from the Academy's guest administrative terminal. Julian scoffed. He tried to laugh. Elena, what kind of paranoid? Read the highlighted text, I interrupted. I pointed my calloused, dirt-stained finger at the crisp blue ink of the State Cybercrimes Division. Julian looked down. His eyes tracked the text. The page read, User J. Vance, Document, Phantom Vantum Invoice. Timestamp, 11:42 p.m. Julian's face completely locked up. The smirk evaporated into absolute biological panic. He dropped his coffee cup. It hit the floor, splashing brown liquid across the pristine linoleum, but nobody looked at it. You drafted the fake vendor invoices to cover her theft, I said. You secured your academic tenure by becoming a co-conspirator to federal fraud. That's a mistake, Julian stuttered. He stepped backward, physically bumping into the wall. I didn't. Evelyn told me it was just a mock budget. I swear to God. He aggressively tried to throw her under the bus. But the board president, a tall, imposing man in a tailored suit, leaned over the counter and read the state-certified IP log. The president physically took a massive step away from Julian. He recoiled in absolute disgust, treating my cousin like a contagious disease. Julian was instantly, completely isolated. I didn't give the room time to breathe. I didn't let the tension drop for a microsecond. I turned directly to my grandmother. She was sitting in the corner accent chair, her knuckles turning white as she clutched her designer handbag. I grabbed the second heavy folder. I tossed a thick stack of 8x10 glossy photographs and a certified flash drive onto the glass coffee table, right in front of the board of directors. Federal bank security captures, I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Subpoenaed yesterday morning. The board members leaned in. The glossy photos were horrifyingly clear. High definition. Time-stamped in the bottom right corner. Frame by frame, they showed my grandmother, wearing her recognizable beige winter coat, sliding massive $40,000 cashier's checks across a teller counter. The checks were being deposited directly into Evelyn's private shell corporation. You knew, I looked right at her. You didn't just sweep my dirty work boots off the porch. You actively walked her stolen endowment directly into the bank. You knew my spine was failing. You knew I couldn't afford my medicine, and you helped her steal $1 million. My grandmother gasped. It was a pathetic, choked sound. She dropped her purse. The heavy gold clasp snapped open, spilling expensive lipstick and tissues onto the floor. I didn't know what the money was, my grandmother cried out, her voice cracking into a high, desperate whine. Elena, please. She told me it was a charity fund. I was just keeping the peace. Before I could even respond to the lie, the door to the tiny dressing room violently slammed open. Mr. Henderson stepped completely inside. He wasn't holding his mop bucket. He wasn't acting like the quiet, invisible janitor anymore. His face was flushed dark red with absolute, volcanic rage. He had been listening in the hallway, and the sickening sound of my grandmother playing the victim completely shattered his silence. She knew exactly what it was, Mr. Henderson screamed. His voice was a physical shockwave in the claustrophobic room. The wealthy board members jumped. I pulled the shredded bank statements out of the executive bins myself. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my grandmother. She stood right there in the hallway and told me to burn the trash bags. She told me to mind my place. I taped those shreds together and I gave them to the only honest worker in this entire family. The board president stared at the veteran janitor in absolute horror, then looked back at my grandmother. My grandmother experienced a total cognitive collapse. The public unmasking was absolute. Driven by the suffocating shame of being exposed in front of the exact high society elite she worshipped, she physically shrank. She choked on a sob, backing herself slowly into the literal corner of the room, pressing her spine against the drywall. The board members actively turned their backs to her. She was completely, totally shunned. I reached into the bag one last time. Evelyn was hyperventilating. The terrified, erratic rhythm of her chest completely ruined the smooth line of her Armani blazer. This is a psychotic break," Evelyn whispered. She grabbed the edge of the makeup counter. Her knuckles were white. "Elena is a heavily medicated. She's a drug addict. This is all forged." I ignored her. I walked straight up to the board president. I handed him the final, thickest manila folder. The kill shot. "Look at the signature," I instructed him. He opened the heavy watermarked cover. Inside was the meticulously reconstructed original vendor invoice, the crisp official black ink, the routing numbers tracing the $1.5 million directly to the Shell Corporation, registered to Evelyn's historical mansion. But it was the blue ink that did the violence. "Look at the wet ink," I said, pointing directly at the center of the page. "And look at the physical indentation in the paper." The board president stared at it. Right over Evelyn's signature was a deep, undeniable, circular gouge in the paper grain. The exact physical impression of her monogrammed brass paperweight, crushed into the document by the jammed shredder blades. It was absolute, irrefutable forensic proof that she had personally destroyed the document. The board president touched the indentation with his thumb. His face went ash white. The blood completely left his cheeks. He slowly looked up from the folder, and he looked at Evelyn like he was staring at an absolute monster. Evelyn saw his face. She experienced absolute biological shock. The blood entirely drained from her face. Her perfectly powdered, camera-ready skin turned the color of wet cement. Her knees violently buckled. She slammed her hands down hard on the glass makeup counter, just to stop herself from collapsing onto the linoleum floor. She just stared at the heavy paperweight indentation on the forensic documents resting in the president's hands. Her mouth opened. She tried to form a word, a denial, a lie about her moral fortitude. But nothing came out. She was utterly unable to form a coherent syllable. Her breathing became terrifyingly shallow, erratic, and sharp. She just stared, micro-fixating completely on the jagged edge of the torn paper grain. She was completely, utterly paralyzed by the mathematics of her own ruin. Heavy, aggressive boots hit the hallway carpet outside. The door to the dressing room was kicked open. It hit the drywall with a deafening, violent crack. 4 plainclothes detectives, led by the state investigator from the Attorney General's office, crowded into the tiny, suffocating room. They didn't ask questions. They didn't hesitate. The lead investigator stepped directly up to Evelyn. He didn't even read her rights yet. He reached out, grabbed the wire of the Sennheiser lavalier microphone, and violently ripped the clip off her $3,000 Armani blazer. The metal tore the expensive fabric. He grabbed her wrists, pulling her hands off the glass counter. The heavy, metallic, terrifying ratcheting sound of steel handcuffs locking tightly around her wrists echoed in the concrete room, directly in front of the horrified board of directors. It was over. You loved giving lectures. Enjoy your new captive audience. The heavy steel handcuffs bit viciously into her wrists. The veneer of the perfect, high society saint instantly shattered. Evelyn fought. She thrashed against the state investigator, her expensive heels slipping and kicking against the commercial linoleum. "I am molding the minds of the next generation," Evelyn shrieked, her voice cracking into a high, hysterical pitch. She spat toward my boots. "You are nothing but garbage. The board will crush you for this." I didn't step back. I didn't raise my voice or react to the insult. I looked at her with terrifying clinical detachment. "You thought you could bury your waist in my yard," I stated, my voice mathematically precise. "But I drive the compactor." The investigators yanked her arms, spinning her around, and dragged her forcibly out the door. The Academy board members watched the entire sequence in absolute deafening silence. The heavy, deafening hiss of a diner coffee machine, violently purging steam, hit my ears. It was exactly 3 days later, 11:30 p.m., a grimy, fluorescent-lit truck stop diner right off Interstate 95. The air smelled like burnt grease and stale cigarette smoke. Evelyn had managed to secure a massive, high-interest bail bond through a sleazy defense attorney. She wasn't in federal prison yet, and her terminal arrogance simply wouldn't let her surrender. Like a completely cornered rat, she used her last remaining shreds of political connections to launch a desperate, deeply malicious counterstrike. She filed an emergency civil injunction, placing a fraudulent lien on my grandfather's LLC operating accounts. She claimed the state investigation was a bureaucratic misunderstanding and that I had stolen heavy equipment from the school. My accounts were instantly frozen. I couldn't buy diesel. I couldn't pay my operators. She demanded a meeting. She slid into the cheap vinyl booth across from me. She looked physically exhausted, her makeup cracked and uneven, but she still wore a designer trench coat. "I froze your accounts, Elena," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "You are broke. You can't fight a drawn-out legal battle. You sign this sworn affidavit stating you manipulated the school's IP logs, and I'll lift the lien. You go back to playing in the dirt, and I keep my academy. Or I starve you out." She slid a stapled legal document across the sticky Formica table. I didn't touch it. I just looked at the coffee stains on the paper. "Look, I really thought you would have figured it out by now," I said, my voice completely flat. "The state attorney general dropped the embezzlement charges this morning." Evelyn smirked, her chest puffed out. "See? They know you're a liar. Now sign it." "They dropped the state charges," I clarified, leaning forward. "Because when you filed that fraudulent civil lien against my company yesterday, you used the U.S. Postal Service to mail the forged banking documents across state lines to a Delaware holding company." Evelyn's smirk froze. The blood completely emptied from her face. She realized exactly what she had just done. The sheer panic hit her eyes. She reached across the sticky table and desperately grabbed my calloused hands. "Elena, please," she begged, tears suddenly streaming down her face, ruining her mascara. "You were always the smartest one. You have your grandfather's heart. I love you, Elena. I'll give you the mansion. I'll give you everything. Just tell them you made a mistake. Please, I can't go to a cell." I experienced exactly 1 second of silence. I sat in the harsh diner lighting, processing the fake emotional validation I had waited 30 years to hear. The words meant absolutely nothing. The hydraulic pressure in my chest was completely zeroed out. "You didn't just file a civil dispute, Evelyn," I stated coldly, pulling my hands away from hers. "You committed federal wire fraud and witness tampering against a cooperating informant. You elevated a local theft into a massive federal crime." I didn't even have to signal. The 2 men in cheap flannel shirts sitting in the booth directly behind Evelyn stood up. They weren't truckers, they were FBI field agents. They flashed their brass badges in the harsh fluorescent light. "Evelyn Vance," the taller agent said, pulling a pair of heavy steel cuffs from his belt. "You are under arrest for federal extortion and witness tampering. Bail is officially revoked." She didn't scream this time. She looked down at the sticky table, her jaw hanging open, finally realizing she had locked herself inside a cage she couldn't bribe her way out of. Because the climax destroyed the entire toxic family structure, you have to understand what happened to the secondary targets. They violently cannibalized each other. They turned into starving wolves, blaming one another to save their own skin. Julian tried to claim Evelyn manipulated him. It didn't work. The FBI seized his entire university hard drive. They found the metadata for the forged invoices. The university fired him before noon. They stripped his tenure and blacklisted him across the entire academic board. I mean, he spent years mocking my intelligence. He told me I just moved trash from one pile to another. 4 months later, a driver at the landfill sent me a photo. Julian was working the night shift at a local luxury hotel. He was wearing a stiff, cheap polyester uniform, physically hauling heavy black trash bags leaking stale beer into a commercial dumpster. The exact wealthy academics he used to drink wine with walked right past his sweat-stained shirt, treating him entirely invisible. He suffered the exact gritty, blue-collar fate he mocked me for. My grandmother suffered a different kind of ruin. Her entire identity was tied to Evelyn's prestige. She prioritized her fake public image over my literal bodily survival. Her downfall was a highly public, brutal social excommunication. The Academy board members told everyone at the country club about the bank footage. The elite families actively treated her like a contagious disease. Her membership was quietly revoked. Her phone stopped ringing completely. She was abandoned to rot in that empty, decaying house, completely cut off from the society she worshipped. Evelyn's dismantling wasn't just legal, it was a highly visual, public execution. The morning show didn't cancel the Channel 8 segment. When the cameras rolled at 7 a.m., the anchor stood in front of the Academy's logo and broke the news of the headmistress's live arrest for federal racketeering. She was publicly humiliated on the exact broadcast she was supposed to star on. The wealthy elite instantly excommunicated her, scrubbing her name from every donor plaque in the city. I drove past her historical mansion a week later. Civil asset forfeiture is a brutal, mechanical process. Heavy steel chains were wrapped tightly around the custom alloy wheels of her $80,000 SUV. Bright, violently neon orange federal seizure notices were plastered directly over the imported Italian marble columns and the custom mahogany front doors. The state literally changed the locks. She was denied bail. They stripped her of her cashmere and silk. They handed her a stiff, oversized orange canvas jumpsuit and a pair of cheap, paper-thin canvas slip-on shoes. Her trial preparation required me to sit in the prosecutor's office and review the jailhouse security tapes. I watched her in the concrete holding area. She wasn't a mastermind anymore. She was just hollow. The cognitive dissonance of her new reality was agonizingly pathetic. I watched a 35-year-old woman who commanded a multi-million-dollar endowment and claimed she molded the future of the city have a complete psychological breakdown in front of a bored corrections officer. She wasn't crying because she felt guilty for stealing. She was sitting on a cold steel bench, sobbing uncontrollably, because she didn't know how to operate the coin-operated washing machine in the cell block. She stared blankly at a standard commissary slip, utterly paralyzed, completely helpless without my grandfather's money to shield her or a scapegoat to do the heavy lifting. She was drowning in the exact reality she created, and there was no one left to absorb the shock. The sharp, rhythmic crunch of tires rolling over loose gravel broke the dead silence of the equipment yard. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about 3 weeks after the arrest. I was standing next to my grandfather's rusted 1970s backhoe, wiping a thick layer of black grease off a hydraulic piston with a shop rag. The door of a cheap, yellow cab creaked open. My grandmother stepped out into the dirt. She didn't look like the matriarch of high society anymore. Without Evelyn's stolen money to fund her weekly salon visits and tailored coats, she looked decades older. She looked shrunken, fragile, and deeply exhausted. She clutched her worn purse to her chest, trembling slightly as she walked toward me, actively avoiding the mud puddles in her expensive shoes. "Elena," she whispered. Her voice was cracked and hollow. I didn't stop wiping the piston. I didn't speak. "Please," she choked out, tears instantly spilling over her wrinkled cheeks. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen. You have to understand. My mother taught me that family is about keeping the peace. You absorb the shock. You make way for the great ones so the family survives. I was just trying to protect the family name. I was manipulated." I stopped wiping the steel. I looked at her. I realized she was completely incapable of understanding financial or emotional abuse because she was indoctrinated to believe suffering was just the rent you paid to exist near power. I looked into her terrified, watery eyes, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. She wasn't some evil, calculating mastermind. She was just a deeply broken, exhausted old woman who was deathly afraid of conflict. She was a coward who completely failed to protect her own grandchild. I didn't scream at her. I didn't argue about the ethics of her choices. I felt a single, heavy throb fire down my compressed lower spine, a quiet, biological reminder of the agonizing physical price I paid for her complicity. A single tear fell down my cheek, acknowledging the absolute, permanent death of my bloodline. I wiped the tear away with the back of my grease-stained glove. All the anger just evaporated. The bond was simply dead. I reached into the cab of my truck, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and handed it to her. "What is this?" she whispered, her hands shaking as she took it. "It's a permanent restraining order," I said, my voice brutally literal and completely calm. "You swept my dirty boots off your porch in the rain to protect her image. Now you can sweep her cell." She gasped, physically recoiling as if I had struck her. I didn't wait for her to apologize again. I turned my back, walked into the corrugated steel equipment shed, grabbed the heavy chain hoist, and pulled the steel rolling door down. The deafening metallic slam of the steel door hitting the concrete floor violently severed the tie forever. I pulled my phone out of my jacket and blocked her number. The heavy echo of that slam rang in my mind for exactly 2 months while the legal system slowly closed the ledger. The financial restitution was clinical and absolute. The federal courts fully exonerated my grandfather's LLC of all charges. The IRS seized Evelyn's historical mansion, liquidated the imported Italian marble and the custom estate, and the bank's fraud division forced a total clawback. The private school's endowment was entirely refunded, and the remaining liquidated assets from Evelyn's accounts were legally transferred directly to my LLC as restitution for stolen equity and systemic defamation. I didn't buy a luxury car. I didn't buy designer clothes. I used the settlement to buy 40 acres of pristine, untouched land, located 3 hours north, less than 10 miles from Leo's new care facility. It was a Tuesday morning. The air was crisp and freezing. There was no suffocating, high-pitched electronic whine from broadcast monitors. There was no sharp chemical tang of aerosol hairspray or burnt espresso. There was no forced, polite laughter from wealthy Academy board members, treating me like invisible hired help. There was just the vast, beautiful silence of the wind moving through the tall pine trees. I climbed into the cab of my grandfather's 1970s backhoe. I had spent the last 3 weeks meticulously restoring the engine, replacing the seized gaskets, and cleaning the rust off the undercarriage. I sat down in the worn leather operator's seat. My spine didn't ache. The suffocating weight of the family debt was gone. I reached out and wrapped my calloused hands around the heavy steel operational levers. I ran my thumb over the familiar worn grooves in the metal. The cold steel felt completely grounding. I turned the ignition key. The massive diesel engine roared to life, vibrating smoothly beneath me. As I felt the sheer mechanical power of the machine hum through the floorboards, I realized the ultimate victory wasn't destroying Evelyn's empire. The victory was sitting in this cab, touching the exact tool of the trade my grandfather used to feed us, and knowing I possessed the exact same quiet, unbreakable strength he always saw in me. I was finally safe. I pulled the hydraulic lever back. The heavy steel bucket lowered to the earth, and I began breaking ground on a foundation built entirely on solid rock.